Oh, hey there. Sorry, I was just giving my followers some crazy information I just learned about a medical condition. Time to watch the likes roll in. What? I can't believe it. It was blocked. Wait, how do they know it's dangerous and misleading? It seems pretty legit to me. Who even gets to decide this stuff anyway? Well, the good news is that we will be discussing that and more in today's lesson. In today's lesson, you will analyze, debate on the issues of free speech in the digital age, as well as evaluate policy proposals to resolve such issues. We have two essential questions to throw your way. The first is a question to consider throughout this lesson, and that is this. Based on an analysis of issues of free speech in the digital age, can you evaluate the different proposals for public policy? Throughout the series, please consider this question. What political and social issues has the digital revolution created? Before we jump in, let's do a little review. Remember, at the core of Western democratic thought and liberalism are civil liberties, such as the freedom of thought, speech, and press. These are typically guaranteed by a constitution and are designed to prevent government involvement in determining what is expressed in civil society. But, as we have learned, there are limitations to these civil liberties, such as defamation, libel, slander, and hate speech. And at the end of the previous unit, we analyzed how the digital revolution caused dramatic shifts in the way information is produced and consumed. Historically, governments have influenced the production of news and information, but content decisions were driven primarily by journalists and media outlets. And digital social media follows the same tradition in terms of moderating content, but unlike traditional media, they do not produce the content. Their users do. This lack of involvement in content creation further removes the platforms from responsibility and public accountability, and that's where we find an issue. You see, as we have learned, freedom of speech is a constitutional right that protects us from government interference, but not necessarily from private interference. Private media outlets are seen as the fourth branch of government, meant to perform a very public function, informing and holding public debate, as well as showcasing public opinion, which, to many, means following the cultural norms of free speech and expression. Given this important duty, traditional media outlets have had editorial control over content, and digital media follows the same precedent. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act immunizes internet companies from liability related to moderating or policing the content on their platforms. This law relates both to taking information off platforms as well as allowing information on the platforms. The amount of user-generated content that flows through the big social media platforms and the political pressure from free speech advocates, anti-extremist groups, and governments has led to a difficult and constant process of content moderation. Dubbed as platform law, each social media platform holds regular meetings to reflect on and update user terms and agreements, content standards, and the moderation process. Facebook's bi-weekly meetings are known as mini legislative sessions. The name reveals the tension these companies are feeling. That's because platform law has placed social media companies as arbitrators of truth, meaning that their user agreements, content standards, and moderation processes act much like our democratic institutions of legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government. Now, these content decisions are made privately, and the platforms making the decisions utilize two main flagging tools. The first is user flagging. This refers to when users mark or flag content for review. The problem with this strategy, however, is that it can be used as a weapon through coordinated flagging campaigns in order to censor political opposition. The other flagging strategy utilizes algorithms. Algorithms are effective. Still, artificial intelligence is better at flagging images rather than text because language is very complex. People use high-context linguistic techniques such as sarcasm and irony all the time. Those techniques require a lot more work on the part of the listener to understand a speaker's true message, and therefore require a tremendous amount of work on behalf of the technology. AI is better suited for topics in which there is a concrete consensus. AI also lacks a clear method because of the nature of complicated concepts such as hate speech. Hate speech and other concepts like it can be difficult to concretely define, and they typically require high levels of understanding in order to avoid discriminating against merely unpopular or oppositional political speech. That being said, unlike democratic institutions, platform law and flagging tools are not transparent. They are also not subject to due process of law, nor to the public for input or accountability. Before we move on, it's time to show what you know. How does Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act impact internet media companies as well as free speech? What issues does platform law create for democratic societies? So here's the problem. We know that manufactured amplification can cause disinformation to spread rapidly on digital media, and there needs to be a way to stop it because it can be terribly destructive. But we also know that giving these privately owned digital media companies limitless power to monitor and control the flow of user-created information is open to bias, both intentional and unintentional. And there is a great profit incentive to not be balanced in this process. So, what solutions have emerged? Well, what has emerged are 4 broad approaches. These include public to private approaches, government approaches, market approaches, and consumer approaches. Let's start with the public to private solutions. In European democracies, public-private solutions have especially gained traction. In 2015, in response to a rising tide of ultra-nationalism in Europe, numerous groups, platforms, and the German government agreed to something they named the Code of Conduct. I know, not very creative, but hey, it ended up being dubbed the Code. That sounds a lot more powerful, right? Well, it turns out it wasn't very powerful at all. The code lacked any real requirements, so in the end, digital media outlets were not made liable for their content. So, in 2017, Germany passed the Network Enforcement Law, or NetzDG. The NetzDG requires illegal content to be removed within 24 hours, while other content needs to be removed within a week. If these rules aren't followed, the platform faces sanctions and fines. The law also requires transparency so that people can see how the companies were meeting the regulations. Critics claim these kinds of approaches place the companies in the role of both the executive and judicial branches because they are being asked to enforce and adjudicate German law on themselves. Which leads to a second issue with this approach. The steep penalties incentivize the removal of content and suspension of accounts in order to avoid violation, which leads to greater censorship. This can create a situation in which companies arbitrarily remove legitimate content to avoid penalties. So those were some examples of public-private approaches. How about government approaches? Well, governments have created something called internal referral units, or IRUs. An example of one of these in America is something called the Disinformation Governance Board. It was a commission that was created within the Department of Homeland Security. It operated as an IRU, making known best practices, monitoring content, and requesting takedown, but lacked any operational authority. Another government approach that has been proposed is what is known as content filters. These use preset parameters to weed out potential disinformation or extremist content before it posts to a platform. China uses this method. The problem with this proposal is that it's based on the concept of prior constraint. Word alert! Prior constraint is the judicial oppression of material that would be broadcast or published based on the grounds that the material is libelous or harmful. But critics of this approach point to IFUs as being vehicles for the government to oppress speech. Finally, we have market and consumer approaches. Updating algorithms so that they adjust users' content feeds based on social values rather than on profit motive is the main proposal that has been brought by the market sector. This strategy frames the issue of disinformation as a question of social value and norms. In order to combat disinformation and extremism, algorithms used to monetize social media would need to be reprogrammed based on values, not on clickability or whatever increases inventory. Think that might work? Well, critics say it's unlikely companies will act in a way that hurts their bottom line, making a profit and growing. What do you think? On the other hand, you have consumer-side proposals. One of these is called Signals of Authority. Signals of Authority is a proposal that relies on educating and giving users the tools to differentiate between disinformation and valid information, essentially helping consumers filter the information themselves. Related to fact-checking, this proposal places the burden of filtering bad info onto the consumer, but it empowers them with the tools to fact-check the authority of the sources. The idea is that users can see the URL and any important information on the URL when accessing information. But critics argue that flagging or debunking or invalidating sources actually has little impact on people believing and spreading information. Before we wrap up, we need you to show what you know. First, please go to the PDF and use the solution sheet to help you organize the pros and cons for each solution discussed in the video. Once you have done that, tell us, which solution do you think helps resolve the tension between free speech and harmful information? In today's lesson, we learned that the rise in digital media creates tensions between ensuring free speech and protecting society from the harms of disinformation. Platform law currently places private companies in the position of navigating such tensions. Numerous solutions have been proposed to deal with the issue. And that's again for us today. In the next lesson, we will look at how the digital revolution has changed our concept of privacy. But until then, be sure to vote, debate, and participate. Hey, hey.